Hello and welcome to Fredosophy, a show about nothingness with the Jerry Seinfeld copyrighted theme. That was a cat tail. In this episode, I'm talking to Evan McMullen, also known to me as Evan McDMT in my phone address list, because that's what I wanted to ask him about. So it's fun to talk to someone who has gone to a lot of spiritual meditation contemplation types of retreats, has had a lot of daily practice, and also happens to have a shit ton compared to the average spiritual journeyist, a shit ton of experience with psychedelic exploration. And from someone who also seems to have had a profound awakening, abiding awakening, then this is an extraordinarily interesting conversation. I saw you in the Stoa interview with Daniel Ingram first, him alone.
Oh, this is when we were discussing his EPRC project.
I think it might have been that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe he
Yeah,
did a
the
few.
Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium thing that he's working on. Basically, I think I interviewed him about that on the Stoa.
Right. You did it. I remember. I think I saw you actually first as a questioner, someone who was
Oh yeah,
asking
so
a
that was his
question.
first appearance on the Stoa. Then that was before the event that I was talking about. Very cool.
Yeah, and I when you started talking, asking your question, I could immediately feel, and I thought to myself loud, "Wow, this guy seems really confident in the way he's talking," and then after that interview, some weeks later, there was the Frank Yang interview. May have been a lot more than a few weeks. Frank Yang and Daniel Ingram and Michael Taft. And then in that interview, you actually said that you had reached something that you called pretty freaking abiding. And I would love to hear more about that. Can you go into more details on what that shift was?
So of course, this is the sort of thing that I just want to say, like an initial disclaimer, is like wickedly hard to speak accurately and clearly about in language, right? So hopefully that's a disclaimer where people can bear in mind that things that can be said simply and easily with language here are going to be some sort of like partial view on the truth, but are not going to actually encapsulate the whole thing, right? So with that being said, so my own personal experience of this whole sort of constellation of stuff has always been a sort of challenge to relate to myself and also a challenge to describe to others, because you have the sort of traditional Buddhist paths, right? Whether you're talking, Theravada style, whether you're talking Mahayana style, Vajrayana style, there's some, like the way that Daniel Ingram talks about, map theories, being a map geek, right? Well, yeah, there's a bunch of like good, interesting maps that come out of Buddhist traditions, right? For a certain type of transformation of consciousness or transformation of the way we relate to ourselves, or something in that broad category, right? And then there's similarly a lot of literature and oral tradition and a sort of much younger and more nascent set of maps and maybe practices that have come out of what you would maybe describe as the current flowering of psychedelic practice and interest in the West that I would say started maybe sometime in the late 1800s, early 20th century with intellectuals encountering things like mescaline and starting to write about it and share it with their friends, and then really kind of got kicked off in the 50s and 60s with the psilocybin study at Harvard and Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, now becoming Ram Dass, that whole movement, right? Very, very sort of young and youthful energy, but also giving some interesting signs of being a sort of proto spiritual movement, and now at this point you might call a full-fledged spiritual movement, right? So um the tricky thing for me, the reason I mention this is because I actually don't have a great sense of what sort of practices and experiences in particular led to which sorts of transformations in the way of relating to self and consciousness, basically. Because so for me, I had my first psychedelic experience, and then within the same calendar month had my first 10-day vipassana retreat, and in this case the Goenka style, right, of vipassana. So they are so correlated in time with me. There was never really a time when I was doing psychedelics without doing a pretty intense Buddhist inflected meditative practice. So distinguishing causality, it's like that's the opposite of a good experiment in a certain sense, right? Because you would want to like try an isolated change and see what happens, and then try a different isolated change and see what happens, or whatever, right? But no, I'm like mixing it all together, and then certainly some interesting and from my perspective quite useful and nice changes end up happening because of that. But it's difficult to say, oh well, was this because of this particular type of meditation practice, or was this because of this particular type and way of relating to psychedelic practice? Well, I was just doing all of that sort of at the same time. So if somebody wanted to potentially try to duplicate the particular things that I did, or that happened to me, or however you want to think about that, well, there's not really any particular book or path that represents. It's a sort of interesting fusion and blend of a bunch of different stuff that happens in my life, but I, it's so sort of like bespoke and non-standard that I can't say, yep, this definitely, this particular meditative tradition and this particular set of things from that were what made the difference. I also can't say, oh, this particular psychedelic and this particular way of relating to it made the difference. It's actually causally unclear what happened and why, if that makes sense. So I do think that that's kind of important to note, or to talk about it at this point, because for some people, well, they've had this particular, I don't know, maybe you practice in the particular kind of Theravada type tradition for 10, 15 years. Well, then that's your practice. You can basically, somebody's like, oh, I really like your vibe, how'd you get to be this way? And they can be like, well, go talk to this teacher in this Theravada tradition, and that's what I did. And it's like, cool, that's a kind of easy pointer to encapsulate a certain practice that led to a certain set of transformations. I can't honestly give such an accurate pointer in my own case, because it's unclear to me what was causal, what was useful, and what was sort of just noise. Certainly I think that a lot of the things that I did and a lot of the ways that I related to things were somewhere between like neutral and actively unhelpful for my own growth and development. This is what happens when you're sort of like navigating a less well charted sort of area of the territory. David Chapman talks about this a bit on his Vividness site when he's talking about paths in Buddhism, and he also talks about the concept of bushwhacking, right? Where you're kind of cutting your own path, and so this comes with a very distinct set of trade-offs. One of which is that it's very hard to communicate about the path that you took, since it's not really on the map.
Right. Yeah. I'm curious to how long did your can you first describe the that shift there? Was there one gradual shift? Was it pretty sudden?
Yeah, I mean there's quite a few sorts of things that from a certain perspective look like distinct shifts, but I think the best way that, at least when I'm speaking to somebody whose mind sort of works kind of similarly to mine, to describe the thing that I think is kind of core, really important, is in my life, in my own emotional experience of relating to life, a really big strain of sort of category of experiences that would cause me a lot of distress were basically what we call boredom, being bored, right?
Being bored.
being bored, you know, like,
Okay.
oh, I'm bored with this isn't fun, I'm bored, right? And so that was a really big part of my life for as long as I can remember, going back to being a really little kid, right? And so then one way to encapsulate the sort of one of the changes that you might talk about is that I essentially have not been bored in, I don't know, like at this point 6-8 years, maybe, like that, maybe longer. And it seems like I've sort of lost the capacity to be bored, to experience this particular way of relating to consciousness that I call boredom. I can remember what that was like, but I just, that's not a state that I really experience, or, you know, it's not a problem anymore. And that seems kind of trivial, except when you actually kind of zoom in on and inspect, like, okay, what actually is the experience of boredom, and how does this relate to the sort of paths and changes that we're talking about? It actually ends up being quite a profound thing when you know, can sort of transition from a sort of, you know, mental attractor state where boredom is a place that your mind goes like quite frequently and has quite unpleasant experience associated with it, to, you know, well, that's basically just not a thing, you know?
Yeah, it was 6 to 8 years ago, I think you said. Was that is that when that shift, the freaking abiding shift, happened, or was that when it started happening, the awakening, or was it kind
It's
of in the middle?
closer to the first thing you said than the second, but this is one of those areas where words get really tricky to pin down a thing, right? Because you might have like say, I think Daniel talks about this some, you know, in some of his interviews, I believe, and obviously the book, that so there is, you know, perhaps a sort of like particular set of experiences that generate a particular set of insights that one can have, right? So then you can say, oh, well, that was the thing, that was the experience, right? But there's also a sort of ongoing, like, unfolding, flowering, like, integration type thing that happens with said insights that is a lot harder to pin down, as far as like, well, it happened at this particular time in this particular month or whatever, right? Because sometimes that will, especially if you're doing the sort of bushwhacking thing, well, that will end up taking, you know, some number of months or years to really sort of um, stabilize the particular kind of like insight or different way of relating to experience that may be like you first kind of actualized in a particular small time period, but then there's a sort of ongoing integration process that is really hard to pin down to a narrow like time slice, if that makes sense. At least that's my experience.
Right. Can you remember when things started to
Yeah,
shift
so
permanently?
basically around this experience that I think you're aware of, at least. So for audience reference, so basically in 2005 roughly, I did a sort of self experiment where I did well, what most people would consider extremely high dose 5-MEO DMT, 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, every day for approximately 3 months. And so there was definitely a sort of thing that shifted during that time period that has not shifted back. Now, that actually being a sort of integrated and stabilized thing that like clearly provided more growth and transformation and good ways of relating to experience rather than destabilization and, you know, like sort of kind of crazy making ways of relating to experience. Well, it took quite a while for the sort of set of, you know, call it insights, if you will, that happened during that particular 3-month experiment. It took quite a while for that to like percolate out through the rest of things and to sort of stabilize and become a thing that I could actually like identify and be like, oh yeah, that's kind of a thing that happened here in this particular way. But definitely something happened then in a certain kind of way that just like shifted a thing that hasn't shifted back, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it's it was
But
actually
and one more thing to add. Sorry, I didn't mean
yeah,
to just for completeness sake. It's also important to note that during this particular time period, I was also spending a lot of time doing like many hours a day doing things in the sort of broad category of Buddhist inflected meditative practices and Buddhist and Taoist influenced martial arts, particularly like the internal martial arts,
Right.
qigong, negong, that kind of stuff. And so it's actually difficult to, again, like I mentioned earlier, specifically disentangle the causality. Was the particular 5-MeO DMT experiment sufficient to cause this shift, or is it necessary to have both the particular 5-MeO DMT experiment and the fairly intense meditative and qigong practice during the same time window? It's not actually clear to me whether one or the other is necessary or sufficient or whatever, right?
Right. Yeah. And the reason why I didn't look surprised enough when you said the 90-day experiment with 5-MeO DMT, which is a really potent psychedelic substance, is that I already knew about this, and this is the reason why I'm talking to you today, Evan. I can actually add something from my own life, and that was I started in 2014 to be interested in awakening because I had I was doing social stunts and pranks, doing one stunt after the other, was trying to top everything and be the craziest guy in the whole world. And the funniest and all that stuff. And then I thought, I can't push the string any longer. Then I will be arrested. And so then I have to do something else. I have to go out, in here if I'm going to become more free, so to speak. So in 2014, I read Jed McKenna, if you have heard of it.
Yeah, I'm actually a big fan of Jed McKenna's stuff. A guy who what was a sort of deep mentor and in many ways the closest thing I had to a real teacher of a lot of this stuff. Turned me on to, among many other wonderful things I wouldn't have encountered otherwise, Jed McKenna, and that was I don't know how it is for everybody, but it was sort of the precisely right thing for me to encounter at that particular point of time. It was really useful.
Yeah, really useful for me too. It was really motivating. It was the first thing I read about awakening, and it was a controversial book and all that. But and it brought me into this nihilistic stage for a while. But it was so motivating, and I was just hooked on the topic. But it also spoke to something that I knew from when I was a kid. Something strange is going on, and it's hard to put the finger on what it is. And here in this book, I felt the confirmation that this is worth looking more into. And then I read, I was really interested, and I read some here and there, and I meditated more for the next 2 years. And then I did ayahuasca. I hadn't really had a big mystical experience before this. I had stumbled upon a few occasions with MDMA, which was powerful in its own psychological sense, at least. But the ayahuasca experience really, broke me through to beyond the ordinary conventional mind, and over the next 40 days, my meditation became, it was like I was coming from trying to meditate to, it was almost like I was being meditated instead. And on the 40th day, no, I don't think it was. I think it was the 39th or 41st, but it sounds better with the 40th day. But let's say it was the 40th day. Something glitched, and it was something that happened. So it was like a part of me was gone, and then the perception turned around. It was like thoughts went into the background, really silent. It was like the most peaceful state I had ever been in, but it was just there. It didn't go away. So that was clearly something permanent. And but after that, I didn't know how I could do it that fast, at least, without the ayahuasca experience. But who knows?
Yeah, so I'm curious, was the context of your ayahuasca experience in a sort of more traditional context where you had somebody playing the sort of shamanic role and doing a ceremony, or was it more like the sort of thing where, oh, you hear about ayahuasca, you can buy the ingredients online and you make it yourself?
That was the ceremony style of doing it in Brazil.
Okay, yeah. So this is just a really interesting thing. I don't know if I've mentioned in a public recording, but so for me, earlier than this particular experiment with 5-MeO DMT that I'm speaking of, there was a really interesting and important shift that happened for me, where the way I sort of relate to it uh, now is to say, well, this particular set of experiences broke my confidence in scientific materialism, if that makes sense. Or maybe to be more specific, broke my confidence in physicalist monism.
Yeah.
And this was a direct result of like having heard about ayahuasca. And so for context, when I had that month where I both had my first meditation retreat and my first psychedelic experience, I psychedelics opened up a thing in me of a space of profound curiosity about things that I wasn't even really aware were things with the mind. And so I pretty much immediately decided to go into a sort of project of trying to experience as many different psychedelics and other mind altering substances as possible. Um, with the, at that point, the way I was relating to the sort of goal of this practice was to develop a better vocabulary for consciousness, right? So noticing that, for example, you have, say, like a psychedelic like mescaline, and then you have like a very close cousin like 2CB, and then a very, very close cousin to that like 2CI. Well, like 2CB and 2CI are the same molecule, except one has a bromine atom in a certain position, the other one has an iodine atom in a certain position. And yet they have different phenomenology, they have different felt experience and particular changes that happen to consciousness as a result of these things being in your body and in your blood. So I thought it would be really cool to develop this sort of vocabulary of consciousness based on the different drug molecules and how we can talk about the phenomenology of those experiences. So this was the way I was relating to psychedelics, and I'd gotten through even like my first 5-MeO DMT experiences, my first like plenty of like profound and high dose experiences with other classical psychedelic substances and obscure ones too. And so I felt like it was sort of going to be no big deal to just like do some ayahuasca. So I get the ingredients ordered from, various people online, and brewed it myself in my apartment with a few friends, and had one of the most humbling experiences of being taught by a deeply wise being that I think it's possible to have. So like, I didn't really take seriously the ideas contained in the sort of shamanic traditions of there being like plant teachers or the plant guides having their own particular kind of consciousness and agency. This was all just like hokey, like pre-modern bullshit to me at that time.
Right.
And I had a certain set of experiences, starting with that first ayahuasca experience, where it was made abundantly clear to me by that particular plant spirit that, nope, there's really a thing here. It's really, in some sense, got its own sort of conscious thing going on. And it let me know very compassionately, but also very harshly, the particular sort of arrogance I'd been carrying around in the way I related to psychedelics as just molecules, as just artifacts that like interact with the brain in a purely mechanistic way. And so that was probably one of the most challenging experiences of my entire life, knocked me off kilter for quite a long time, but also contained an invitation to continue working with these things, and ayahuasca in particular, in a more respectful and way, basically, right? So that was another really interesting experience and shift that happened for me.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Those humbling trips. I'm sure you've had many of those. But wisdom here, where you got taught, was it more? Was it like, hey, Evan, we're actually real beings communicating through the plants? Was that kind of how it
That was
was?
definitely a part of it, though. So the particular sort of content of that experience was, I had, a group of friends that we were all sort of like psychonauts together and would try new like things as they became available to us. And we're basically all pretty smart, kind of nerdy, scientifically oriented Western people, and it had just been no big deal to like try new things and like see how the experience unfolded. We hadn't really like met anything we couldn't sort of handle as a group. And so in this particular experience, the content for me was basically on the lines of, you arrogant bastard, look what you've gotten yourself and your friends into. There's a reason that there are like shamanic lineages surrounding me speaking as like the voice of the ayahuasca plant, and you basically done fucked up with your arrogance here, and this is not necessarily going to be pleasant for you, but as long as you're here, here's some things to know. And so by the end of that experience, the sort of message that had been transmitted is that I had permission to work with that particular thing myself in a one-on-one basis, but I was absolutely not to make this brew and give this thing to other people for the foreseeable future, until I received quite explicit permission from that particular plant spirit to actually share that with people. Like, but I was not ready to share that with people, basically, right? It was a sort of sacrilege to do so. And so I then worked with that particular thing with ayahuasca for several years, just myself and it, before being sort of uh, allowed into the space where it was okay for me to do that with other human beings, where I was making the brew and they were drinking some of it, and that would like not be a terrible affront to the whole thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, wow, that's so interesting. So now today you're doing once in a while you're leading ceremonies with ayahuasca.
I have done that after the sort of thing that I just described.
Mm.
It has not seemed particularly indicated, to use a Jed McKenna sort of language here, to do that in the past, say like 8 or 9 years. That has not really been a thing, which seemed like it wanted to happen. Not that I am averse to or like feel unqualified particularly to do that with the right group of people, but that's a sort of, in my opinion, a quite demanding and sort of advanced level of this particular kind of practice. And I have some quite mixed feelings about the way that like going to the jungle and doing ayahuasca, even with a real shaman, which I, to be clear, am not, in those particular lineages, is, it has become a sort of fad, a sort of like thing to check off of the like, I am a cool spiritual world traveler kind of person archetype. I have some very mixed feelings about that particular dynamic in our society. And so there's usually if people want to relate to spirituality and psychedelics and the combination, I feel like there are things that are sort of like make more sense to do in a sequencing order type thing with them. And also, as I've mentioned on the Stoa, I've kind of been mainly a hermit and spent like basically all of my time either just like working a fairly like normal job, and you know relating to my wife and to my two cats, and basically not really having much in the way of friends or social contact beyond a sort of small and frankly relatively superficial level of connection with people over the past, say, like 7 or 8 years. And that's been just the way that my life has unfolded in that particular time period, and is not problematic. But it also means that the sort of likelihood that I'm going to be like doing ceremony with people in this particular way is just not really a thing.
Have a limited social circle.
Yeah, like sort of a de facto hermit, assuming that you can, be that while you have a job, basically, because I have to work to make a living. So like in that sense, of course, I go out of the house and I spend time around people and so on. But it's very much a job for me. I don't really have much social contact with people, outside of the context of going to a job and getting paid to do a job and then coming home. That has actually shifted pretty deeply for me since the pandemic. I personally am, I don't mean to minimize the effects that the pandemic has had in a negative sense on people at all. I recognize that for most people in the world, this has just fucking sucked. But for me, it was a really beautiful past couple years, because I had basically given up on the idea that there were people who were interested and willing and capable of like having the sort of discussion that we're having now, of really talking and relating to this sort of stuff and in a way that felt good to me. I tried that for a while after and during some of these shifts were taking place, and it basically seems to be sort of like there wasn't really a space for that. I didn't really have a tribe, so to speak, to talk to about that. And I tried for a long time to sort of make that happen, and it didn't seem to really want to happen. And so I had to make my peace with that and realize that there had been a deeply important and transformative set of experiences and practices in my life that basically nobody really wanted to talk about and people weren't into. And so sort of had to, go through realizing that I had to accept that this might be the case for the rest of my life, and I still had to live and make my way in the world in such a way that this wasn't like a tragedy. And so I did. And then I had sort of never expected the sort of unfolding of things that happened for me in relation to the Stoa and the evolving ground. I simply hadn't really thought that was possible. And so it's been really beautiful to see that that's possible, and see the people drawn to these attractors, and to meet so many people who are interested in having the precise sorts of conversations that I find most meaningful and most valuable.
Interesting what you said about closing the social circle, and in Theravadan language, that shift that I talk about, I see that as the stream entry shift. So I don't know how it is like to be a fourth path, which is basically what they call enlightenment, where the sense of doership and agency is seen through once and for all. But I became a kind of a lone wolf traveler, and right now I'm parking out of my in my mom's backyard, and I have a trailer there that I sleep in. I can sleep inside here as well, but I choose to do that. So I've really simplified my life. And it's just been the way it went. I do have critics, and I used to have, who were in my face, family and friends, and maybe this doesn't happen with the average person who's going through a spiritual awakening, but probably many enough to really notice that they don't want to do. So you have kept your day job, right?
No. So for most of my 20s, I didn't have a steady day job. I had various day jobs that happened for time periods, and then the usual pattern is I'd get some day job for some reason, and often a reason having to do with social pressure from friends or family to do that basically.
Mm-hmm.
And the day job would end up being incompatible with my sort of chosen path of, well, you might call it spiritual investigation and inquiry. And so the day job would get chucked, and then I would also spend really significant amounts of time couch surfing, living out of tents, riding a bike around, engaging in, shall we say, the underground economy in ways that should be obvious given the content of our conversation. And basically like not doing the day job thing at all. And when I did do it, I could never bring myself to take it seriously at that particular point in my life, say in my 20s. So I don't know. I probably spent like a slight majority of my time in my 20s technically employed, but like when I was technically employed, not really taking employment seriously as a thing at all, but just as a sort of like, well, guess this is the thing I'm doing. I guess it gives me some money, but as soon as it gets obnoxious and conflicts with the sort of investigative spiritual path that I'm on, it goes right out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost, and I'm not sure if everybody's who is on the spiritual path is wired this way, but I seem to also quit a lot of things.
Like I'm a sort of creature of extremes, like not just in the spiritual path sense, but just this is a thing that people who know me would probably readily agree with. And so, you know, if I'm gonna do a thing, I get really into it and I really just fucking go for it. And if I'm not, you know, well, nope, it's not important, right out the window as soon as there's a conflict with anything important. And so, given that this whole thing we might call a spiritual quest or path was obviously the most important thing that I could possibly be doing in my life at the time, then, well, anytime anything came into conflict with that, whether it was a, you know, relationship in the romantic sense, whether it was a job, well, that's the thing that got chucked.
Right. Yeah. I also have. I need to be feel really meaning in order to do something, which is not always constructive. But I try at least to get in touch with that space in myself, and then usually something inspired will come out of it, and then I will really go for it. I'm curious about the freaking abiding shift that you described. How would you how does your reality look like after a shift like that?
So, so I mentioned the thing about boredom earlier. That's a component of this, right? Though it's not nearly the whole story. Like the sort of transition from being the sort of from the transition from relating to experience in the sort of way that um, you end up regularly experiencing boredom to then a shift where you're relating to experience in the sort of way where you never experience boredom, right? That's part of it, but not nearly the whole story. Um, I find that.
Sorry for interrupting. Could that
Mhm.
be synonymous with the restlessness, boredomness?
Um, so I actually don't necessarily think so in this, at least not the way I'm using the word. So one of my favorite sci-fi authors, Neil Stephenson, in his book Anathem, has a quote that I've found actually quite useful and profound, where one of the characters says, "Boredom is a mask frustration wears."
Okay.
So this idea that boredom is, in a certain sense, the experiential result of sort of a false way of relating to a particular kind of frustration. Like it's actually a mask for frustration. And so, um, regardless of any other changes, there's this interesting shift that happens when one stops relating to that particular kind of frustration in this kind of masked and false and like deceptive or delusive kind of delusional kind of way, and can actually just relate to it as the frustration that it, you know, actually is. Um, which represents like a nice positive transition, according to me, with respect to sort of like self honesty with respect to one's own experience, right? Like, um, it's more polite to say that you're bored than that you're frustrated, right? Um, and yet it's often, maybe always, more accurate to say you're frustrated when somebody might feel that they want to say they're bored, right? So this is a particular kind of shift that happens, and it ends up having cascade effects that lead to other shifts. And so it's difficult to say, you know, I think that, again, Daniel Ingram talks about this a bit in his book in the sections on maps, right? That like, okay, there's a sort of framing from which something like a Theravada four path model makes a lot of sense and tracks a lot of people's experience, right? But there are also people who seem to have similar or identical types of deeply abiding shifts in the way that they relate to their own experience of being a conscious being, which don't map or track onto the Theravada four-path model in particular very well, right? Maybe map onto some other Buddhist model, or maybe don't map onto Buddhist models at all in terms of the, narrative history of that person's own life transitions, but that seem to have produced basically the same sort of shifts as we talk about with, like, say, fourth path or something like that, right? And so it's really kind of problematic for me to find the right set of, like, map metaphors that actually map onto, if you'll pardon the pun, my own, narrative memory of my lived experience. But one thing that I would say is that, so there is a sort of shift that happens that I would describe as not an instantaneous, like, boom, now you're fourth path, now everything's gravy, and, like, there's no more unfoldings that happen, right?
Mhm.
For me, I would describe it more as, like, there's, like, if you think of two different, like, attractor basins, right? Like, in the sense of, like, do you know this sort of metaphor of attractors, right? So, like, imagine you have, like, two valleys, and then there's, like, a ridge in between the valleys, and you've got a drop of water that's coming down, and it's, like, going to hit the ridge, and this is a sort of, like, chaos and complexity thing. Well, like, which attractor is it going to end up, falling into this attractor base, and which valley is that drop of water going to end up? And especially when you iterate, you drop a bunch of drops of water in, like, the same or very similar places. What's the tendency? Are they going to tend to collect in this valley? Are they going to tend to collect in that valley, right? So the way I would describe it is that there's a shift that happens where your way of relating to your own experience either tends to end up being a sort of, like, complicated and delusional way of relating to your own experience. And then there's a sort of set of shifts that happen where the attractor has shifted. So even though you may end up in a particular moment relating to your experience in a sort of confused, kind of, like, unenlightened way, right? That there actually is just a fundamental shift that's happened that over time you're going to end up relating to your experience in a less confused, more clear, more accurate, I would say, way. And so that shift is to me, like, the kind of fundamental thing in the way that I relate to my own sort of narrative history of life experience. That there was a definite shift where, like, I kind of shifted from being in one attractor to another, and that process seems, to me at least, to be a continually unfolding one. And this feels related to what Daniel Ingram again talks about, since he's a shared, set of, metaphors and linguistic constructs that we can refer to. I like to lean on that. Shift, that then you basically end up in this place that sort of corresponds to eventually, you'd be sort of satisfied with your progress and satisfied with the way that you are relating to experience, right? So this sort of, in the Theravada sense, is, like, related to a total reframe of experience in a way that changes your relationship to what you might call dukkha in a sort of permanent sense.
Because when I had that shift I talked about, I felt that I remember I said to myself, "This is 100 times more meaningful than my life before."
Absolutely, yeah.
Even though my life wasn't that bad. How was that? So it did. So I mean, I get frustrated sometimes, and you say you don't almost get bored at all, or none at all. Yeah. It's just no boredom. Is there no frustration too?
I wouldn't say that there's no frustration, but again, using that sort of metaphor of the attractor basins, like, before there would be a thing where, like, I would become frustrated about a thing and not really notice that consciously, right? And so, it would become a sort of, like, to use the language that I picked up in the Goenka retreats, a sort of, like, start a sort of sankhara, right? Where, like, there's this unfolding from this seed of frustration, because it's not related to fully an experience, fully consciously, in a sort of way that has equanimity to it. Then it sort of, like, festers and grows in the sort of, like, subconscious or unconscious layers of the mind stream, and then it has a bunch of cascade effects that actually end up leading you to tend to relate to the next experience and the next experience in a sort of like diluted way, right?
Mm.
And so it's like, it's not that I don't experience frustration or other negative emotional states, and this is related to I think that the sort of models that talk about like higher paths or whatever, just like not having negative emotional experience are basically wrong according to my experience of the way things have unfolded.
Right.
But there is a distinct reframe that is deeply abiding of the ways that negative emotional experience no longer form like festering seeds that sort of like infect your later experiences. They're just, well, negatively valenced experiences that can be experienced fully, and then you have the next moment happen.
Yeah, so the loop doesn't start, or it doesn't get quantified.
Yeah, and like psychedelics are really useful for noticing the way that this like loopy phenomenon happens and self-reinforces, because of the way that, like, say with things like LSD in particular, you have, most people who've had some experiences with LSD will recognize what I mean when I use a phrase like self-reinforcing thought loops.
Yeah.
And so like there's an important sense in which like having a negative emotional experience and not having it become this sort of like self-reinforcing loop is very similar or perhaps identical to the sort of skill set whereby like a transitory negative experience while on LSD does or doesn't lead to a bad trip, right?
Mm-hmm.
It seems to be a very related sort of, mental capacity or set of mental moves or something like that, whereby you can be the sort of being that doesn't have bad trips ever, and be the
Yeah.
sort of being that like doesn't relate unskillfully to negatively valenced emotional experiences. Those seem to basically be the same thing to me.
Yeah, because I imagine that in life there will always be triggers or tendencies in personalities and preferences. It's just that the weight is wearing off the more we see what's really going on. And I'm curious because I should have mentioned this in the beginning of the podcast, but I think you've done something like several hundred LSD trips, and probably
Yeah, at least.
yeah.
Actually, I'd say depending on how you want to define when one trip ends and one trip begins and so on, like probably like an order of magnitude more than that.
Yeah. So in total psychedelic experiences or events, over 1,000.
Oh yeah, I mean, so there was basically a 10-year period of my life where, like, during my waking hours, it was significantly more likely that I was having a psychedelic experience with a psychedelic substance than that I was not. Right. So like the majority of waking hours for a particular roughly 10-year period of my life.
Right. Yeah. Wow. So you have you have met some demons, and you have met and does that I've done maybe 8 real mushroom trips. And some of them are just they're just so humbling. They're really whipping me hard, like it's like a tough grandfather.
Yeah, if mushrooms in particular are doing that for you, I think they must think you can handle it, because mushrooms are a particularly, like, if we want to relate to these things as like plant teachers, as having some sort of intentionality or consciousness to them, mushrooms seem to be really good at giving people kind of precisely what they need, but not pushing them too far over an edge.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Good to know. I hear some. I think I heard Dennis McKenna say that he would prefer mushrooms over ayahuasca, because mushrooms could sometimes lead you into delusional places, but again, there's this ceremonial aspect to ayahuasca, which is really clear and solid and habitual. Not so many ceremonial ways of doing mushrooms around. So there could be that too. But yeah, one more thing is entity attacks, or entity being some talk about these energies that people can bring with them after a psychedelic trip. Uh, what's your perspective on that?
So that definitely seems to be a thing. The language that I sort of would use in my sort of like native way of relating to this, the way that I would turn that into language that I could talk to another person in English about, is quite different from the sort of framings that you will see in the mainline psychedelic sort of new age or spiritual influenced scene. Um, so I can attempt to explain it in that sort of the way that I actually relate to it. I can also just say yes, that's definitely a thing, and be careful for that.
Right.
But the way that I relate to it is that there's a sort of sense in which um, obviously if you're coming from a sort of Buddhist inflected lens, you realize there's a sense to which the idea of like a single unified self identity is an illusion, right? It's not like really what's going on with consciousness and mind and so on, right? So
Mm.
um there's a lot of different computations that are being like executed or implemented in the sort of thing we might relate to as our brains. And most of those don't have to do with the thing that most people relate to as their selves, right? They're for an interestingly Buddhist compatible take on this. Thomas Metzinger's book Being No One, or his much more approachable sort of popular summary of that called The Ego Tunnel, is a great sort of thing that's done by like a neuroscientifically informed Western philosopher who's was like a student of Krishnamurti, right? So that kind of thing. So the way that I sort of relate to the thing that you're talking about these entities that can kind of stick to you and kind of have some negative effects is that, are you familiar with the term egregore?
No, I may have heard it, but
So
never.
egregore is a term from the sort of like Western occult esoteric traditions, which basically is like a magical thought form with some intentionality to it, or like a thing that is given rise to by the belief of many humans or something like that.
Yeah.
If you've seen the series or read the book American Gods by Neil Gaiman, like the gods in that are could be viewed as a certain kind of a kinds of egregore. So basically the model that I'm using to relate to this sort of thing is something like we're running a bunch of different computations on our brain. A small subset of those computations give rise to the phenomenology that we call the self. A much larger set of those computations do just basically other shit, like regulating the body and, the sort of unconscious, preconscious, instinctual, like, the thing that causes you to pull your hand back from a hot thing before you even can consciously realize what's going on, all that kind of stuff, right? But there's a lot of other stuff that the brain is doing with its compute capacity. And some of these things are distributed computations where parts of them are being run in many different human brains. And these give rise to sort of emergently complex behavior that, yeah, it kind of does make sense to talk about as having like agency or intentionality. And not all of these sort of like emergent complex agents that are implemented in a distributed fashion across many different human minds, not all of these have a particularly benevolent relationship with the humans on whose minds they're running. Some of them have a relationship that's closer to parasitism than it is to symbiosis. Some of them are just purely positive symbionts that enable the humans that they're running on to live better lives. Some of them, though, are parasitic on the humans that they're running on. And these you might refer to as demonic egregores or something like that. And so I definitely think that's a thing. And I definitely think that doing psychedelics in the wrong context or with a low skill level or with people who have high skill but bad intentions are the sorts of ways of doing psychedelics that lead to a greatly increased probability that you will be running more demonic egregores on your mental substrate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. So there's one could call the entities basically thought forms that are being programmed in when you're caught off guard during a vulnerable situation and with in a potent psychedelic situation. Do you have any advice on how to avoid that?
So my best advice for that is so of the people that I know that sort of went to even roughly comparable psychedelic depths, the ones who ended up sort of like most benefited and least damaged by that experience had a pretty strong grounding and foundation in practices somewhere in the neighborhood of like mindfulness meditation, Raja yoga, Zen, Shine, like concentration meditation, but like the sort of mental tech which allows you to relate to your own experience more skillfully, right? So I'm actually like, as I've gained more experience and seen more people go through more experiences, I've kind of become less enthusiastic over time about the idea of people just doing psychedelics as a genuine method of spiritual transformation, and more sort of like in favor of the perspective that psychedelics can be a really useful adjunct to the sort of like mental tech or like the psychotechnology, as people will say on the Stoa, that's in the cluster of things like Buddhist meditation and Raja yoga and things of that nature.
All right, cool. Yeah, good answer. After the first ayahuasca experience, well, the first one, the first breakthrough was on the second ceremony. Um, I came into a extremely intense, dark place. We're talking, you have killed the whole world, a place, and guilt. But after that shift, 40 days after, uh, I haven't really had any psychedelic experiences that went out of hand, even though I have been deeply challenged during some intense moments. But I've always used some type of surrendering uh, activity to and trust, because I found that to make things better rather than thinking that this is bad. Something bad is I have done something bad with myself now.
Yeah. I mean, so I don't know if you saw the series that I did on the Stoa when I was a sense maker in residence there. But I did a session that had the subtitle Neurophilosophy. And
Okay.
so one of the models that I sort of put forward in that is in the broad category you might call virtualism, right? Which is related to what you're saying in the sense that like the entire phenomenal world that you experience as the world, right, is in some sense obviously generated by your own mind, right? It's generated, and if you want to use a sort of like Western scientific perspective, like your brain generates a sort of virtual reality for the purpose of improving prediction of the organism and its interaction with the environment. Um, could look at things like predictive coding, predictive processing, free energy type models, and sort of like cognitive science as the sort of things that will point you in this direction. And so what this means is that what we're experiencing and relating to as the world is not at all identical with what physicists are talking about when they talk about physical reality. We're interacting with a sort of mental construct, like our brain is spinning up something like the Matrix, but not in an evil way, like for our benefit as organisms, right?
Yeah.
And so your experience in a certain sense can't be like wrong or bad because it is just the best faith effort of the creature that you actually are to represent what's going on. And so how can that be bad? That's just like a thing that this creature is doing in order to survive and thrive in the world. And like relating to experiences that like this experience is wrong or bad is just like a category error. It just doesn't actually make sense given the context of what experience seems to be and what seems to be going on, even starting from a scientific materialist perspective in that sense.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. The no self is something I'm particularly interested in. Um, do you think that psychedelic trips can can get you into territories where meditation will take at least longer time to get into,
Absolutely.
and then
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
I
then
mean, one of the quickest routes to a genuine like no self or non-dual type experience, like at least for a particular time slice, is high dose 5-MeO DMT. Seems to quite reliably produce in people with high enough dosage a sort of non-dual no self type experience, which of course is not abiding and will fade as soon as the thing wears off, but you want a taste of that. Well, that is a way to get that. Now, again, the stuff I said a few minutes ago, this is an extremely risky sort of fucking thing to do if you don't have a pretty good grounding in a sort of psychotech practice, like, like the sort of yoga that's about the Yoga Sutra, or pretty decent like meditation practice from the Buddhist tradition or something like that. Like it's a high risk sort of activity to seek out that type of experience with high dose 5-MeO DMT without that sort of scaffolding. But it does seem to pretty reliably produce the sort of experience that you might not find in just doing meditation, unless you are lucky enough to have done it for a few years of like regular multiple hours a day practice, and also have some opportunity to go do extended retreat for like 10 or 20 days.
hmm yeah. Oh, that's really juicy. So, can you explain what it? Because I haven't done 5-MeO DMT or smoked regular DMT
Yeah.
for that
So they're
matter.
completely different phenomenologies. The guys at the Qualia Research Institute on their blog, their Qualia Computing blog, have some really interesting and insightful articles that try to capture some of the differences in phenomenology here, and also theorize about what might be going on in the brain that relates to those differences in phenomenology. So I just want to leave that as a pointer. If people are interested in that, that's a great resource. And they're really great human beings who are obviously like having a lot of fun and doing good things in the world. So, wanted to plug them. But
Yeah.
basically, there, so 5-MeO DMT. So let's start with the regular NN-DMT experience that more people will at least have heard descriptions of through, if nothing else, people like Joe Rogan and so on, right? So like this is the thing where like, and Terrence McKenna talks about this all the time, right? Where you like, or talked, I suppose he's not with us anymore, but you know, you sort of have this sort of breakthrough experience where you're in this sort of like fractal hyperspace where everything's made of living language, and there are like entities that he referred to as self-transforming machine elves, but say the ayahuasca shamans will have totally different names for. But there definitely seem to be these sort of like hyperspatial entities which have their own sort of independent consciousness that want to interact with you or whatever, right? And this is sort of like the characteristic phenomenology of high dose DMT experience, right? Well, the characteristic phenomenology of high dose 5-MeO DMT experience is much closer to just like the process that does the creation of a separate self is like suspended for those 5 or 10 minutes, and then it sort of gradually comes back online, and there's a weird way in which you can watch it come back online.
That's the 5-MeO experience.
Yes, that's the second one, is the 5-MeO experience.
So it's
So even though
basically
they're both called DMT and are very similar molecules, they have such utterly different phenomenologies where, the 5-MeO DMT experience is not about being in a space at all. It's not about relating to any entities as separate or identical with oneself. It's like a very non-dual type experience, in a way where 5-MeO or regular DMT, I should say, like NN-DMT, has definitely the phenomenology of that takes place in a sort of space and takes place in relation to like entities which are in some sense meaningfully separate from oneself. And so it's not really a non-dual type experience in the same particular way that 5-MeO DMT, the character of the experience, is sort of like overwhelmingly non-dual.
that is so interesting, especially coming from the pragmatic Dharma space. That 5-MeO DMT is essentially an insight. You could perhaps categorize it as an insight substance, while DMT would be I don't know, concentration magic type of
Yeah,
substance.
like DMT, NN-DMT seems to be much more useful when relating to things in a sort of, yeah, like magic with a K type kind of way. Whereas 5-MeO DMT seems to bring out and encourage relating two things in a sort of like non-dual, insight flavored kind of way. That seems to be a pretty consistent difference in the phenomenology of those substances, when reported by people who have all of those words and have done both substances.
You said, okay, so the boundaries of the self is suspended for those 5-10 minutes where you're smoking 5-MeO or taking it in some way, and is that in the state you are now? Does it make a difference? Is it like going deeper? It's the same kind of no self experience, but it's perhaps many dimensions.
Yeah, I mean, so I want to say yes and no. Like, of course, there is an extent to which, like, if I were to just like pick up a thing and smoke 5-MeO DMT right now or whatever, right, that like there would be a sort of much greater emphasis on the non-dual aspect of this moment, right? But it's also like at this point relatively trivial to, without drugs, like have a sort of more gradual transition into basically the same sort of place where the sort of non-dual aspect of the experience of these particular moments will be the thing that's really heavily emphasized. So like it's definitely like a sharper transition into that, but it doesn't at this point really give me personally like affordances for ways of relating to consciousness that I don't also have without doing any particular drug, if that makes sense.
Right. And there's not much fear of death or ego death any longer.
Oh, so that is another thing I could mention as the sort of transition that occurred with 5-MeO DMT with that particular, roughly 90-day sort of experiment, is that I certainly haven't related to things in a way that could be accurately described as fear of death since then.
Wow. And that was in 2005 now? Yeah.
But it took a long time, as I mentioned, for that sort of to unfold and stabilize into what feels like a healthy and non-crazy and non-chaotic sort of vibe, if you will, right?
Right.
Because it's definitely possible to not have a fear of death, but to be batshit crazy in many other ways.
Yeah. Jed McKenna, or was it? Yeah, I think he said 10 years to learn to live with this thing, and I think Shinzen said 10 years to learn to live with this monster. And I also think that you mentioned that it's like you as an engineer, you work with I think you made the example Limex. No, wait. Windows, and then you upgrade to
yes, correct. Yeah, I did use that analogy.
Yeah, but then you have to as you upgrade software, you have to prepare for a whole lot of different problems.
Yeah, well, and like literally more problems from a certain frame, right? Because like, so something like Windows or like Mac OS, right, as an operating system for your PC, it makes a bunch of decisions for you in terms of the way that you're going to end up interacting with that PC. The designers of that product make a bunch of decisions for you in such a way that those decisions can't be changed by you, right? Like you live with it, for better or worse. With Linux, though, there's a much greater set of decisions that you yourself as the user actually get to end up making. And so this introduces way more choice to your experience of using the computer. But frequently people switch from Windows to Linux and are very overwhelmed by the choice and by the fact that there are not nearly as many sort of like guide rails or hand holding in that sort of computational paradigm. And so, like with great power comes great responsibility. With an extended capacity for choice comes a greater sort of like capacity to, well, fuck things up for yourself. And so, there's definitely a sense in which like having some additional affordances in the form of freedom will also inevitably kind of pull in some additional sort of like constraints in the sense that, well, you have to learn to use that freedom responsibly. There are ways in which you can use it irresponsibly, and this will go poorly for you and others. And so there's a sort of learning process where there's a bit of an uncanny valley. Like you transition into this space of having more affordances, more freedoms. And you sort of have to learn the lay of the land with this increased capacity and freedom. And you do this by, to use a pithy phrase, fucking around and finding out. You do this by basically making some bad choices and taking the consequences and seeing, what unfolds, and gradually learning to be more skillful with this increased capacity for choice that you now have developed.
Right. And so as you fuck up and try and learn, what could be examples of that? Could that be, for example, extreme honesty suddenly, now that you know that everything's one, and I can just try that out now and just say what I'm feeling, and then perhaps later you think maybe I should adjust it a little
Yeah,
more.
like you'll have to come to a deeper relationship with what the word honesty actually means, right? If you really
Right.
try to take honesty as a practice seriously. And you'll realize that it's not as simple as that there's one true thing you can say in the moment and everything else is false. There's actually a whole space of things which are true, which could be said in any given moment. And so, which true thing you say in each moment is actually the much harder problem than deciding to just be honest all the time, in the sense of literally saying true things every moment, right? But skillfully relating to which out of the infinite set of possible true things you could say in that moment is the skillful thing to do. This is basically part of the bodhisattva path, if you will. And so there's a similar thing that happens, in terms of this, like relating to the increased capacity for choice, and how this is a sort of double-edged sword that happens with respect to like one's own ability to transform one's own consciousness, right? So for me, it's like gaining access to the sort of skill sets that allow you to like sort of arbitrarily shift the way that you're relating to consciousness in interesting and potentially useful ways, right? This is sort of the sort of thing that's gestured at by in Buddhism, talking about the siddhis, right? Well, these come with some additional affordances, but also there's like many different ways to use this and fuck things up for yourself and for others, right? Like one particular set of things that happens to me is that I don't quite want to call it telepathy, because that brings in a bunch of connotations that are totally wrong. But there's a sense in which like other people's actual sort of like internal emotional states became much more transparent to me, in a very abiding way, such that like, if you're sort of like flashy and just using this in a sort of way that doesn't respect what's going on, then this can lead to really freaking people out all the time, right? By like, how the fuck could you know that? How the fuck could you know that about me, sort of thing, right?
Oh, okay. Okay.
If that makes sense. And so that's another case in my own life experience where like you have to come into a relationship with this increased capacity for seeing and choosing, in a way that is like responsible and compassionate to yourself and the other beings around you. And that doesn't automatically happen when you get those capacities. I seem to learn, at least, by fucking up in particular ways and sort of experiencing regret for the harm that I've caused to myself and others, and resolving not to cause that kind of harm again, and gaining some sort of like skill or wisdom in this. Like this is related to, again, what Daniel Ingram speaks of as the training in morality being the infinite one. Like you can sort of max out insight and concentration, but you can't max out morality. There's always more to learn there.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any practices that you do or recommend, or see other people have are living in this mode of seeing can do to integrate the thing?
Yeah. So like it's really underemphasized how important the cluster of things that we might describe with phrases like body work and energy work are to this whole unfolding.
Hmm.
Like people that are going through spiritually transformative experiences, I think, really ought to have access to a skilled and sensitive body worker who has some energetic awareness, and also really ought to explore the sort of practices that, uh, in a Chinese Taoist frame might be called Neigong or Qigong, or, energy work practices of that form, right? The sort of energy balancing, internal alchemy type practices there. Kundalini yoga does a similar set of things within the sort of Indic tradition, though myself and so a lot of people I respect have made the observation that it sort of comes in with a little bit less built-in safety or guardrails than the Qigong Neigong thing does. So, you can use that framing too, but just be aware that there might be a little bit more like safety built into the sort of doing that thing from the Qigong frame as opposed to the Kundalini yoga frame.
Oh, interesting. Um, when you said body work, does a tantric type of body practices come to mind?
Definitely. Though the thing I was thinking of when I said that, like just actually like structural body work, like myofascial massage, deep structural body work was the sort of thing I had in mind. But yes, the tantric sort of stuff that you're talking about too. And I'm glad you brought up before we're done today the word tantra, right? Because this describes an important thing for me where like I started out, obviously, going to like Goenka style Vipassana retreat and so on, relating to Buddhism and the Buddhist tradition in a way that's like quite sutric and Theravada specifically, right? And I currently think that the best way to relate to the Buddhism thing for most Westerners who are sort of culturally similar to me, at least, is actually is the Tantrayana frame rather than the Sutrayana frame. So like I'm basically in agreement with people like David Chapman and with like Charlie and Jared, who started this thing called the Evolving Ground, which I'm a part of and a huge fan of. That basically, given that Westerners are not really compatible with renunciation as the engine of their progress, which is what the sort of sutric paths are based on, right? They're based on an engine of renunciation, right? You look at the precepts, the Shila, like you give up those sorts of things which are likely to produce the sort of like emotional experiences that are difficult to process, and this like is sort of the way that these sorts of things work. Whereas the sort of tantric frame is no, you actually cultivate the skill set of working extremely skillfully with emotionally intense experience. And to some extent in Tantra, you actually do practices to intentionally call up emotionally intense experience and the sort of things that Sutra says you should avoid. Tantra sort of says, well, no, we're actually going to skillfully and sometimes ritually call up this sort of thing and use this as a sort of training ground to relate to it more skillfully. And I think that the tantric approach here, and especially the recognition of the sort of non-duality of samsara and nirvana that's embedded in the tantric Tibetan approach, is a far better way of relating to this stuff for most Westerners than the sort of sutric renunciative approaches. And I'm pretty firmly in that camp.
Nice. It would seem to me that doing tantric practices where you get to, because I'm sure with this insight you want to integrate it, and as you said, with using it for compassionately, or for the, I'm so slow today, a little sleep deprived, but training compassion would be the essence of morality, perhaps, and yeah, doing these body work practices would then train that capacity to connect with other beings and develop or cultivate intimacy, which I think perhaps is the one of the cornerstones of the purpose of the integration.
Yeah, that sounds right. I really like that framing of cultivating of intimacy, both like with other beings and also with like each moment itself and our own experience, like being intimate with beings, with experience, with ourselves. Like this definitely seems like the right thing to do. This is important. And like, yeah, like in particular, there's this sort of like, I mean, to people coming at things from a sort of Buddhist frame, it should be a sort of hopefully uncontroversial statement that the duality of mind and body is just as illusory or delusional as any other duality, right? The mind and body are a sort of non-dual thing with respect to each other, not meaningfully separate things, right?
Yeah.
And so this is one reason why body work can be so effective and important in this particular sense, because body work, the standard conventional framing says that body work is somebody working on your body, which is separate from your mind, right? Like getting a massage is a thing that happens to your physical body, but not to your mind, really, right? Well, like actually, that's like impossible that could be the case, because there isn't a clean separation between the physical embodiment and the mind, right? It's a non-dual thing. And so getting, like, receiving and giving body work, like massage, like other forms of somatic therapies, does something really interesting to unlock different ways of relating to the body mind, that are less dualistic and more integrated. And I think that's, for most people I know, giving and receiving that has been an important part of the ways in which they've made progress, basically.
And from what you have seen, does it seem credible that focusing on the insight part of the game would be a faster way to develop the compassion part of the game?
I don't know, honestly, but something about that framing sort of is uncomfortable for me. And I guess what I mean is that, like, ultimately separating things out into like insight and concentration and morality is like it's a useful sort of framing for having certain types of conversations, but for this particular thing that we've been sort of circling around or talking about in this particular slice of this conversation, I feel like it's kind of misleading, because I feel like morality and insight and concentration are like mutually supporting capacities that sort of need to grow together, and if they don't grow together, then something dysfunctional has happened, basically.
Right. Yeah. If so, you have to go at 50. Let's see.
No, I've got 23 more minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Yeah. We've covered so much. I haven't done a whole lot of podcasts like this, so I don't know when to finish, but I'm sure we could finish soon and wrap it up. It's been a
Yeah, I mean, or if you've got
one.
something you wanna cover that we haven't gotten to in the space of the next 20 some minutes, like one thing that may be worth mentioning, you can cut this out if it doesn't seem useful, is one thing that was incredibly useful for me, now knowing that you have encountered Jed McKenna and found that also to be a useful sort of thing to have encountered. It's particularly interesting that the first two books had come out when I was having my my 5-MEO DMT experiment. The third one had not. Spiritual Warfare came out in 2007, right? And so that's another thing that I wish had existed, sort of earlier for me, so that I could have had access to it when I was coming from the sort of framing of Jed's first two books, because I feel like the sort of message of the third book of Spiritual Warfare, where he's like essentially presenting this model where, in his terms, human spiritual adulthood is the thing that you should actually be targeting, that everybody wants, and like it's kind of like a sucker's game to actually like target like full enlightenment, right?
Yeah.
This seems deeply important to me and true and related to the thing that we were just talking about, right? In the sense that, like, that is basically another way of saying the thing that I was saying, I think, about how like the morality, insight, and concentration training sort of like really want to grow all together in mutual support, and like just hitting the insight aspect of training really, really hard and sort of de-emphasizing the concentration and morality aspects. It might be the sort of shortest path to the way that Jed McKenna is describing it, like full enlightenment, but it's not really the happy path for humans. You should probably, I think, people should probably in general, like, work on all three trainings, in concert in a way that will be likely to produce what Jed calls human spiritual adulthood. And that's really the thing that wants to happen here. And enlightenment is more a thing that happens to you, rather than the sort of thing that you should have an intentional practice to reach, if that makes sense. Or, another way of saying this is, you should not target that as your goal unless you literally have no choice about the matter.
Yeah, I heard that. Well, I checked the forum. I don't know if this is the real Jed McKenna, but he has been saying that for years. but he actually passed away. The forum, Jed McKenna, passed away a couple of months ago. I think. Did you hear about it?
No, I haven't really been following that side of things for a few years. I've always found it interesting to speculate about like the physical body identity of Jed McKenna because it seems quite clear that that is a pen name. And there are in various Buddhist circles like various there are theories about which famous spiritual teacher is Jed McKenna or is he one or so on, and so that's interesting news to me, and I was not aware that like one particular Jed McKenna instance had passed away, so that's interesting, and I'll have to check that out. I'd be interested if you can send me links to those posts.
Yeah, I'll do that. Um,
like when I was working up at the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York, one common thing that people would talk about who knew about Jed McKenna is that there are some like really shockingly precise overlaps between his statements and writing and the statements and writing of Adyashanti, for example, right? Who was someone who we hosted up there for, and who offered retreats at Omega, and so we all interacted with, and like there's a really interesting set of overlaps between Adyashanti's perspective and Jed's perspective there. So like, would it be totally shocking to me if like Jed McKenna was a pen name of Adya? Well, no, it wouldn't be totally shocking to me. Would it be totally shocking to me if they were totally different people? Nah, that fits too, So it's really interesting to sort of think about like the way in which the Jed McKenna persona is like playing with and dancing with the sense of identity in that way, right? There's something very cool about that.
Yeah, it's always fun to next to the spiritual work, it's fun to talk about the who's and what's happening with their personal lives.
It reminds me of Alan Watts talking about like the way in which like we're in a certain sense God playing hide and seek with itself or whatever, right? And like the sort of like speculation about what's the true identity of Jed McKenna feels like very much an instance of that sort of like universe as a playful puppy, like playing hide and seek with like God playing hide and seek with itself, like that sort of like fun and lighthearted framing with respect to things like identity.
Yeah. It's identity would be is so if I'm talking about some person, if my meditation is on point, and I'm going through a kind of an equanimous stage, I can see that when I'm talking about people, it feels like a projection of me, so when I'm talking about this great teacher or this really interesting teacher, it becomes kind of the boundaries drop a little, and it feels like I'm just looking for myself, looking for answers for myself, or thinking that person has something that I don't have, but I just haven't realized it. And then in these, especially, was this powerful mushroom trip I had this summer where I thought I was essentially enlightened for an hour.
I've had many of those. Yeah.
So I was desperate for hitting up teachers who had been going through this thing. I couldn't believe that it was possible to go through this thing to ever be able to integrate it. It was so unfathomable that people could live with this experience, this mode. It's a great way to wrap it up. So thank you so much for.
I want to just add one thing before we fully wrap it up, because since you are on the theme of identity, something sort of cropped up in my mind that felt like worth sharing, which is one thing that I think doesn't get enough play is the sort of notion or insight that identity is actually not really a noun. It's a verb. Identity is a process that we do, not a fixed thing, right? And so there's an interesting sort of set of transformations that can unfold from really taking that as a sort of a practice, like the practice of noticing that identity is a thing that the mind is doing, but not a fixed aspect of the mind and of consciousness.
Yeah, so even in grammatical terms, it's officially a noun?
Well, obviously in English,
Wait,
the word
no, verb.
identity is grammatically a noun. But what I'm saying is it's the sort of noun that's actually pointing at a process rather than a fixed thing, right?
Yeah.
It's the sort of noun which is pointing at a process that we do with our minds, not an immutable aspect of what it means to experience, to have a mind.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, definitely seems like an activity. One could think who's the owner of all this stuff when it's going on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for doing this with me, Evan. And yeah, I had many clarifications on things, and especially in the Venn diagram zone of psychedelics and awakening, which I'm especially eager to find more, because there's not a whole lot of information out there. And also take the pragmatic dharma part of the Venn diagram, and then there's a cozy, really juicy little zone.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I appreciate very much that you talked to me today.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure for me as well. I've had a great time having this conversation with you, and definitely hope that we can have more, whether recorded or just however that can happen. I'm definitely would love to keep in touch and keep hanging out and talking for sure.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, it seems like you enjoy talking. You should do more. I didn't find you on so many places to when I was looking. I actually spent some time finding your name, I think, or a way to contact you, and that happened to be through Twitter. But yeah, you're a great podcast type of personality. So
I'm definitely not optimizing for being on the most podcasts and acquiring some sort of fame. So that's definitely not what I'm doing, though. I mean, so yeah, I don't know if you want to cut this from the recording or whatever, but there's actually quite a bit of content out there from the past year. So I did 2 episodes of the Integral Stage with Layman Pascal. I did an interview with Forrest Landry on the future of spirituality on Noetic Nomads YouTube channel. I can send you a list of the Stoa sessions in which I was either the interviewer or part of the panel, part of the sort of not just a person in the audience, which is probably like 8 or so, not counting the 7-part so far series that I did on the Stoa. So you can find the Bridge series on the Stoa. There's a playlist called The Bridge with Evan McMullen on the Stoa's YouTube channel, which has 7 sessions currently, and there's going to be a couple more coming out soon. I'm probably missing 1 or 2 appearances there, but if you haven't seen that stuff, various topics are covered. If you find the sort of conversations I tend to get into interesting, then those might be fun places to start if you haven't seen all of those.
Yeah, that's great. So now people got a little bit more info on how to watch more of your teachings.
And if you do, I wouldn't call them teachings. I'm sort of allergic to the teacher label and the teacher-student dynamic, but I like to think of myself as someone who is interested in being friends with people and interested in sharing my experience in a friendly way that hopefully can help people. And I think that's important. I'm not trying to claim or be a teacher. I'm just trying to be what I like to call a spiritual friend.
Right. Yeah. That's beautiful. Okay. I think you just got to go now. So yeah, thanks again. And
yep, total pleasure. Thank you too.
Yeah, likewise.
Sounds good. I hope you have a wonderful evening.
You too, man. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.